The I want to take this opportunity to welcome our president, Dr. Blanchard, sitting right there. Appreciate his support and the great job that he's doing here to move the university forward. We have record enrollment, many programs and activities on the campus. And I think I speak for everybody saying thank you for your leadership. Now, we also have our Dean of Arts and Science, Dr. David Garrison, and his wife, Donna Barger, sitting right here. And of course, we have Dr. Gary Klein, who is our chairman of our Department of Political Science and History, and a longtime member of the Association of Third World Studies, and participant in many Third World forums. And so we want to recognize him and recognize all of you who know that your attendance and participation is appreciated. This series got started 1981, one seminar, and we've continued it since then. Most of you weren't even born then, I know, a lot of you. But anyhow, and then we created here, actually in 1983, it's our 25th anniversary, the Association of Third World Studies, which I'm proud to say is the largest professional organization of its kind in the world, and it's based right here at Georgia Southwestern. So we're proud of that. We're going to have our 25th anniversary celebration and 26th meeting at Millersville University, October 26th to 28th, and you're welcome to attend if you'd like to. You have my personal invitation. And so the seedbed for all this, including the Journal of Third World Studies, were these seminars. This is what we started out. And we continue these seminars. We think it adds to academic life significantly at the university, and we do cover the major issues of our time, and to try to provide people with a better understanding of what's going on in the third world, which makes up 3/4 of the world in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. And tonight, let me thank, problem is when you start introducing people, thank Bob Slanker, who tapes from our technology department, tapes these programs, seminars, and shows them on Channel 16. And I have people stopping me all the time, post office. And they say, see you on TV, so you on TV. But they appreciate the opportunity they can't get here to see it on television, Channel 16. And, they learn from this. So they're part of it. And so tonight we're focused on Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan. So these are areas where a lot of things are going on, and a lot of these developments affect the people there and the people here, as we know. And we have 3 outstanding speakers tonight: Brian Parkinson, Richard Hall, and Brian Smith. And Brian, Dr. Parkinson is our first speaker. He's assistant professor of history here. In fact, he took my position. And he did. He replaced me in 2005. And He's done an excellent job here. He received his BA in history from Georgia Southern and his master's and PhD from Florida State University, and it was in Middle Eastern history, and teaches a lot of courses in the third world area on Africa, Northern Africa, Arab-Israeli conflict, Central Asia, and so forth. He's fluent and he has research competence in 3 languages, or really 4, including English, and Arabic, French, and German. And he's taught at Florida State in Tallahassee. He's taught at their London Center. And he's published in scholarly journals, including Journal of Third World Studies. He had an article recently in our journal. And he's given papers at a lot of professional meetings, and also was a Fulbright Scholar to South Africa a few years ago. And Dr. Parkinson's going to talk about major developments in Iraq. So please join me in once again welcoming Dr. Parkinson to the Third World Seminar.
Thank you, everyone. Just having some technical difficulties. Please stand by. All right, so today I am going to talk about modern Iraq. We're going to start in relatively recent history. So I'll explain, the major areas of Iraq, and then some recent history up through, 2008, what's going on in Iraq today, including the surge. Okay, so we'll hopefully get that started. It should be up and running in a second. So if you don't know by now, Iraq has 3, almost 4 major ethnic groups, religio-ethnic groups, and those would include the Kurds, who are predominantly in the northeast, in the mountainous areas of Iraq, and they are predominantly Sunni in their religious orientation. We also have Arabs, and the Arabs are divided into two camps mainly, and those are Shiite Arabs and Sunni Arabs. Shiite Arabs make up almost 60% of the total population in Iraq, with Kurds and Sunni Arabs making up the remainder of the population. They're split pretty much evenly. And so what happened in early Iraqi history relative to last century is that the British had a mandate or a protectorate for Iraq. And under that mandate, under that protectorate, what they tried to do was put these 3 groups together. What they tried to do was to put these 3 groups together so that the British could practice a policy of divide and rule. And what divide and rule basically does is puts groups that don't get along together so that they can fight against or amongst one another rather than independently rising up against the British. So what the British would do is say, okay, look, we only have one position. You 3 groups are going to have to fight it out to elect this one particular position, and therefore you would have Sunnis and Shiites and Kurds all fighting amongst each other and not rising up against the British. And we should be pulling up very soon PowerPoint. And why would the British go to all this trouble? Why would the British go to all the trouble in Iraq? Oil. They knew there was significant amounts of oil in Iraq, especially at this time in the Kurdish north, in the areas around Mosul. Okay, it is the Modern Iraq lecture. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Okay, so push the button, and we've got a PowerPoint. Yay! So as I mentioned earlier, the three major areas are Shiite, Sunni, and Kurdish. The Shiite areas are predominantly here in the south in the orange. Okay. The Sunni areas are over here in the green, and this is what they call the west, because honestly, no one lives out here. Okay? Very, very few people live out here. Maybe some Bedouin. And finally, the Kurdish areas live up in the blue zone, up in the north. That is the mountainous region in the north. And I have a lady's name up there. Her name is Gertrude Bell. This is the woman who suggested to Winston Churchill at a bar in Cairo in 1922 that we ought to put these three people together. So if you want to blame all the problems on Iraq today, you can blame this lady, Gertrude Bell. She's the one who came up with this policy, said if you want divide and rule, put these three groups together, they love each other. No, not really. Okay, so let's move on. Let's talk about the Baath Party, because I'm sure a lot of you have heard very much about the Baath as a political party, as the political party of Saddam Hussein. So where does the Baath Party come from? What are its origins? And what does it stand for? Well, it actually comes out of Syria. This man right here, Michael Aflaq, a Syrian Christian, not a Syrian, but a Christian from Syria, he started the Baath Party. And he had three main tenets for Baathism. What are those three main tenets? They are Arabism. We should put being an Arab ethnically, culturally, socially, we should put that to the forefront of society. Why would he say this? Because he doesn't want it to be Islamicism, okay? Naturally, he's not a Muslim, so of course he would say Arabism over Islam. Secondly, the second pillar of Baathism is socialism. Socialism. Okay, this is partly a reaction to Western imperialism and capitalism. And then finally, nationalism. Nationalism is the third and final aspect to traditional Syrian Baathism. All right, now Baathism will eventually migrate over to Iraq, and a special guy named Saddam Hussein will become a member of the Iraqi Baathist Party. So he was a key figure who, in the Iraqi Baathist Party that will help overthrow the government in July of 1979, and in that process he will kill off many of his own opponents in order to take full control over Iraq. Now, Saddam Hussein, he's going to add one major component, one extra key to Baathism, and that is militarism. Okay? He is quite the militant. All right. And looks a little bit different here from the last pictures of when they found him in the hole in the desert. Okay? All right, so let's move forward to these Gulf Wars. Right now, we are in the third Gulf War. That's right. Operation Iraqi Freedom is the third Gulf War. Well, where are the other two? What are the other two? The first Gulf War was the Iran-Iraq War, which took place between 1980 and 1989. And what we see here in this war is a regional shift to the Arab-Persian rivalry, which does happen and take place throughout history. And what is the basis for this rivalry? It is not just ethnic but religious. Most Persians are Shiite, most Arabs are Sunni. And Saddam Hussein was a Sunni Arab ruling over a Shiite Arab majority in Iraq. Okay, so why do we have this war? Well, this war is taking place against the backdrop of the 1979 Islamist revolution in Iran. Okay? And during this war, or during the revolution, Saddam Hussein looks over to Iraq's traditional foe, Iran, and sees that they are in the midst of a revolution and they are very weak. And what he wants to do is he wants to redress a treaty between Iraq and Iran over the Shatt al-Arab. And I know it just sounds like I said a dirty word, but I didn't. The Shatt al-Arab is the corridor, Iraq's only corridor to the Gulf. Iraq has a very narrow access to the Gulf in which it can import and export goods and commodities. And what Iraq wants to do in 1980 is garner a larger control over that region known as the Shatt al-Arab. And so that is what the war was about. And so who will, in this war, the United States, under Reagan and Donnie Rumsfeld, that's Rummy right there, shaking hands with Saddam Hussein, who will the United States support in this war? Will we support Iraq or will we support Iran? And why? We support Iraq. Why do we support Iraq? Because we see the Islamic Revolution of Iran as a dangerous omen, and we don't want that to spread westward. Okay? Secondly, the United States is supporting Iraq in this war because the Soviets, the USSR, they are going to support Iran. The USSR supports Iran because they want to contain the revolution in Iran. They don't want that revolution to migrate or filter up into Soviet Afghanistan. Okay? All right, and so what does Ronald Reagan do during this war? We funneled both money and arms and weapons of mass destruction into Iraq. That's why many of our own congressmen believed George Bush when he said we have weapons of mass destruction, because we had given it to Saddam Hussein. All right, so this was a very, very bloody war. Over 500,000 people died in this war. And in this war, Iraq got support, received support from Kuwait and from Saudi Arabia. What kind of support can Kuwait and Saudi Arabia possibly give Iraq during this war? Moral support? Go on. No. What they gave was money to the tune of $80 billion. All right. They gave that money to Iraq for the war. Iraq said, okay, I'm fighting this war on behalf of Sunni Arabs everywhere, just like in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. So you give me the money, we'll do the fighting. The United States, we're providing the weapons. Eventually, though, both sides will want to sue for peace, because in this war, both sides will suffer massive amounts of casualties and fatalities. I said up to 500,000. They are exhausted. The war exhausts both Iraq and Iran. And so the United Nations will come in and settle it. What we did learn in this war is that for Iraq, nationalism trumped religion. In the Iran-Iraq war, Shiites in Iraq supported Iraq rather than their Shiite neighbors in Iran. Okay? All right, so let's move on and talk about the Second Gulf War. That is Operation Desert Storm. Okay? And that took place in 1991. And what I have here is the two major invasion points of Saddam Hussein into Kuwait, and then the American reaction from Saudi Arabia into Kuwait. All right, so many people are under the impression that the United States went in to save Kuwait from, an imperialist Iraq, which had, invaded Kuwait with no provocation except for oil. Many people think that the Second Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm, was merely over oil. There's a little bit more to it. There's three major reasons why Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Firstly, tradition and history. Kuwait has traditionally been a part of Iraq. Okay? Iraq, for many, many, many centuries, belonged to the Ottoman Empire, and under the Ottoman Empire, Kuwait belonged to Iraq. So they saw the two as inseparable. Secondly, Saddam Hussein, well, actually, part of that first part, is that Saddam Hussein saw the Kuwaitis as also being Arab Sunnis. That would enlarge the number of Sunnis in Iraq if he took Kuwait relative to Shiites. All right? The second point is that after Kuwait loaned Iraq the money to fight the war against Iran, Kuwait wanted that money back, and with interest. And Iraq said, Saddam Hussein said, wait, I thought you were giving me that to fight on your behalf. And Kuwait says, no, that was a loan. You need to pay us that back, and with interest. And so he's not happy about that. And finally, and I think this is perhaps the most important, Kuwait was horizontally drilling into Iraq, stealing Iraqi oil. And I always like to liken that to, what if Mexico was drilling, slant drilling into Texas, taking Texas tea? All right? Will we be in Mexico City tomorrow? Right? Okay, so that had a lot to do with it. All right, and then finally, let's move into the third Gulf War, Operation Iraqi Freedom. All right? Let's talk about the surge. Has the surge worked? Because we hear both of the presidential candidates talking a lot about the surge, and they're talking about it in very, very broad terms. Just the surge. And there's a lot more to this complex issue than yes, the surge works, or no, the surge hasn't worked. Okay, so let's talk about it. Okay, let's talk about more elements than just putting more troops on the ground. So let's talk about some key elements in Iraq that have led to the numbers of both civilian Iraqi deaths and the casualties to American troops to decline. First, we have ethnic cleansing. From the time that we went into Iraq through 2006, we saw significant amounts of ethnic cleansing in Iraq. Shiites pushing Sunnis out of their neighborhoods. Sunnis pushing Shiites out of their neighborhoods. This led to over 2 million Iraqi refugees trying to seek asylum or refuge in places like Lebanon, Egypt, and particularly Syria. Okay? So we have ethnic cleansing. This here is a map of pre-2006 Baghdad. All right? And in this map, you will see that the blue areas are Shiite, the red areas are Sunni, and the yellow-green areas are mixed neighborhoods. So you can see that before the war, Baghdad was primarily a what city? Mixed, right? Now let's look at it today. Except for the green zone where we are, Baghdad is primarily either A, Shiite, or B, Sunni. So what we've seen is that there are no more Sunnis in Shiite neighborhoods to ethnically cleanse. There are no more Shiites in Sunni neighborhoods to ethnically cleanse. So therefore, once they've done all that, there's very few of these, ethno-religious killings or murders that are taking place. Okay? And therefore, you will see on this graph that the civilian deaths in Iraq have gone down as they have ethnically cleansed their neighborhoods. Okay? All right. Another major point to the surge is that as we have put more troops on the ground in Iraq, these people, unfortunately, and I wish they were, they're not stupid. As we have put more troops on the ground, more boots on the ground in Iraq, they have left Iraq and gone to Afghanistan. So the insurgents, the terrorists, they have moved. As we've moved more troops into Iraq, they themselves have left Iraq and gone to Afghanistan. And you can see it on these graphs. What I have here is on the top graph, I have U.S. troop fatalities in Iraq by month. And you will see the red areas is the surge. And so you can see that the numbers of American troop fatalities have gone down as a result of the surge in Iraq. But we have to look at what's happening in Afghanistan at the same time. Terrorists have gone to Afghanistan, and you'll see British troop casualties and fatalities going up. And over here, you'll see American troops and fatalities, their casualties and fatalities going up as well, commiserately. Okay? We also have the Anbar awakening. Al-Anbar is in the western Sunni province. Up until recently, terrorists, insurgents were hiding out in Sunni villages. And from these villages, they would strike into Baghdad and then return to these villages to have shelter, to have asylum. Okay? Well, the United States made a plan in which they would work with Sunni tribal leaders, sheikhs, in Anbar province to get their cooperation. The Sunni sheikhs in Anbar province wanted to cooperate with the United States. Why? Because these terrorists were moving into their neighborhoods and causing problems for them and their neighbors. And so, of course, they wanted to work with the United States to get these terrorists out of their neighborhoods. How did they do that? First, we paid the Sunni sheikhs to help us. So we were funneling money to people that would no longer fight against us, but fight against outside foreign insurgents or terrorists. Secondly, we provided them with arms. And thirdly, they are providing us with information on where these people are holed up so that our ranger units, our special forces can go in there and take these people out. Okay? And you can see by this graph that the number of casualties from sectarian violence in Anbar province has gone down precipitously as we have funneled money, troops, and weapons to these sheikhs. And then finally, Shiite militias. Perhaps the most famous of all these Shiite militia leaders is this gentleman right here, Muqtada al-Sadr. Muqtada al-Sadr is an imam, and he is the son of an ayatollah and the grandson of a grand ayatollah, two of the most highly ranking figures in Shiite Islam. And he has a massive militia in Sadr city on the east bank in Baghdad. That'd be the Tigris, of course. And so what has happened is he and his men rose up for a time being, only to be knocked back down by the American military. Since then, he has called a truce. What they are doing is they are laying and waiting for the Americans to leave. They are not going to rise up again because they don't want the Americans to beat them down again. So they are just waiting and waiting. And meanwhile, he is being funded by Iran. He and his militiamen are being funded by Iran. But right now, they are not doing anything because they don't want to waste troops fighting the American forces, which, by the way, when the Iraqis or the insurgents or the terrorists fight American forces, they lose. They lose because we have a much better, more well-trained and better technology to deal with them. All right. So that's the end of my slideshow. Yay! Okay. Should I close this? Okay. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. That was very interesting. Our next speaker is Dr. Richard Hall, professor of history here at the university, specialist in Eastern European history, received a BA from Vanderbilt and MA and PhD in history from Ohio State University. He's written extensively on the Balkans and has done a lot of research there. Teaches courses on Eastern Europe and Yugoslavia and Germany and modern Russia and historiography and a lot of other things. And Dr. Hall is going to talk about major developments in Iran. So please join me once again. Welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Isaacs. Iran is the modern name for the ancient nation of Persia. Iran has a particular importance in contemporary issues. It is the largest nation between the Mediterranean Sea and the Indian subcontinent, with a population of over 70 million people. Further, as Dr. Parkinson has said, Iran is largely a Shia Muslim state. Now, Islam is divided into a majority group called the Sunni. About 90% of all Muslims are Sunni, and the minority section called Shia. The differences between these two are not great. The Shia generally assume a more emotional perception of the truth of Islam. Also, the Shia, because of centuries of being in the minority, tend to view themselves as more apt or more willing to be martyrs for their cause. Now, Iran is the largest Shia nation in the world and is at the center of the main concentration of Shia Muslims in the world. That is Iran, neighboring Iraq, as Dr. Parkinson said, and the Persian Gulf. Here's its importance. The recent history of Iran has been very turbulent. At the beginning of the 20th century, the country was divided between Great Britain and Russia into spheres of influence. And during the First World War, the northwestern part of the country was the scene of some fighting between Russians and Turks. After the First World War, an Iranian general named Reza Pahlavi seized control of the country and granted himself the ancient Persian title of Shah, that is monarch, or emperor even. He ruled the country until 1941, when he was deposed by the British and the Russians, who suspected him of pro-Nazi leanings. He was replaced by his son, who was named Muhammad Reza Pahlavi. The son was considered to be more pliable because he was a bit of a dilettante, kind of a playboy, interested in the ladies and the booze and not in governing the country. Iran occupied an important strategic location during the Second World War. British troops and Russian troops and later American troops entered the country, and it was a point of transit between the Indian Ocean and Russia for American and British goods. After the Second World War, the British largely pulled out, but the Americans and Russians retained an interest. The Russians only left under some American pressure in 1947. But Shah Muhammad Reza Pahlavi remained rather unpopular in the country. In 1951, a nationalist movement led by the Prime Minister Mossadegh nationalized the oil industry in Iran, sorry. And because of this problem, the CIA overthrew Mossadegh 2 years later and restored the power of Shah Muhammad Reza. The Shah then became much more committed to the American cause, became a firm American ally, bought all his military equipment from the Americans, sold his oil to the Americans, even sold oil to Israel on the Americans' advice. Also, the Shah undertook a so-called White Revolution, in which he began to industrialize the country, in which he undertook some agricultural reform, giving more land to the peasants, in which he tried to secularize society, allowing women to have a public presence here in this, again, overwhelmingly Shia Muslim country. But to do this reform, he relied on a lot of brute force, especially from his Israeli-trained secret police, the Savak. And he alienated a lot of people. He also alienated the religious authorities who didn't like this modernization. And in 1979, the accumulated distress forced the Shah out of the country. This is a so-called Islamic Revolution that Dr. Parkinson alluded to. After 1979, Iran ceased to be a monarchy and became an Islamic republic. Essentially, Iran continues to be an Islamic republic today, is an elective democracy with a kind of extended Supreme Court. A Supreme Court with extended authority run strictly by, as if every judge was a fundamentalist Christian, or in our country, or a fundamentalist Muslim in their country. Now, this Islamic Republic soon came into conflict with the United States. Its client guy gone. The conflict came later in 1979. Over the disposition of Iranian assets outside of the country, and a group of Iranian so-called students, not clear who these people really were, seized the American embassy in the capital Tehran and held the people there hostage for almost 2 years to gain some leverage. They were only released in 1981, and by that time the Americans, as Dr. Parkinson pointed out, had clearly come down on the side of neighboring Iraq, which sought to take advantage of the new government in Iran by launching an attack on Iran. And this resulted in an 8-year war caused huge casualties, perhaps as many as 1 million people on both Iran and Iraq's side, used such horrific weapons as poison gas on both sides, and ultimately ended in a stalemate. The Americans firmly supported Iraq, and so were no friends of Iran in this. And at the end of this war, another incident even more emphasized the hostility between between Iran and the United States. An American guided missile cruiser stationed in the the Persian Gulf shot down an Iranian airliner. This is called the Vincennes Incident, after the name of the American warship. Shot down an Iranian airliner carrying 290 people. They all were killed. The Americans evidently thought they were under attack by the airliner. The Americans have finally paid compensation for this accident, but relations remain problematic. Now, again, as Dr. Parkinson's given a lot of my talk for me. As you knew from him, 1991, the Americans fought in the Persian Gulf. The Iranians stayed apart from this, but then the Americans returned. And the Americans returned to the region in 2 ways. In 2001, the Americans invaded neighboring Afghanistan. This was a big break for the Iranis. The Taliban regime in Afghanistan, which I'm sure you're going to hear more about here in a minute, was anti-Iranian. The Taliban regime was a fundamentalist Sunni regime, and the Americans eliminated this regime. This enabled the Iranians to extend their influence greatly into Afghanistan. Western Afghanistan, especially the important city of Herat, are more or less under Iranian protection even now. There's a significant Iranian-speaking, Persian-speaking minority in Afghanistan. This is called, the language in Afghanistan is called Dari, but it's Persian. And so this has enabled the Iranians to gain much more credibility in there, and even to reach to the north to the Persian-speaking former Soviet Republic of Tajikistan. So the Iranians have considered, the Americans, by knocking out the Taliban, have enabled Iran to gain a great deal of credibility to the east. Then the really big favor the Americans did for Iran was to invade Iraq in 2003 and to dispose of Iran's old enemy, Saddam Hussein. Now, as has been pointed out here, 60% of the population of Iraq is Shia Muslim. These Shia, in the absence of Saddam Hussein, have turned to Iran for support. The Mahdi army, which Dr. Parkinson mentioned here, as a force in being, now awaiting the departure of the Americans, in effect to take over, is trained and equipped by the Iranians. This is just a matter of time for them. The big victor of American invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan has been Iran. Now, what are they going to do with this? They're going to take over the Persian Gulf. It's not called the Persian Gulf for nothing. They've already extended here to the east. I should point out also that the elimination of Saddam Hussein, before we go back to the Persian Gulf, put them in direct contact with their old ally Syria, and through Syria, Iran now controls one of the most important military forces in Lebanon, Hezbollah, which is Shia Muslim. Again, armed and trained by Iran. Now Iran has a force in being on the borders of Israel. Now, what do they want to do with this? Again, the Persian Gulf. The Persian Gulf gives them two important advantages. One is control of oil. Almost all of the oil from Saudi Arabia and from Kuwait, from Qatar, from the United Arab Emirates goes out of the Persian Gulf. The Persian Gulf is strategically very much under Iranian control. If you look at the map that Dr. Isaacs provided you, you'll see the choke point here called the Strait of Hormuz. The Persian Gulf itself is littered with a number of tiny islands. It makes maneuvering for large warships extremely difficult. The American Navy does not want to put a big aircraft carrier or a large cruiser in this body of water because it's very vulnerable to attack by small vessels. The choke point, again, is right there, controlled by Iran. And you notice a little finger of land sticking up into the Strait of Hormuz. This is called the Saddam Peninsula, under the authority of the United Arab Emirates and Oman. Right now there's talk of digging a canal across this Saddam Peninsula so that the Straits of Hormuz can be can be avoided. The other advantage of the taking over the Persian Gulf is to unite the Shia under one control. Most of northeastern Saudi Arabia is Shia, including, and it's not pointed out here, but the main Saudi oil port is called Dhahran. It's Shia. This little island nation of Bahrain is Shia. And there are significant Shia minorities in the UAE, in Qatar, and in Oman. These are all under the control. All these states here to the south of Iran are controlled by relatively weak Sunni monarchies. Now, in this circumstance, what are the Americans' options? Well, one much talked about option is an attack on Iranian nuclear facilities. The Iranians are in the process of building up a nuclear program which can give them the option of constructing an atomic bomb. It's not clear exactly where they are in this point, or in this program. The Americans sometimes suggest that they could go bomb these facilities. This isn't easy. This isn't easy. Where are they located? Certainly, even if all the facilities are known, you can expect they're going to be well defended. The Iranians are known to have purchased a large number of Chinese, North Korean, and Russian weapons. They're going to defend these things. There's also been some talk that the Israelis might take these things out. But this, in a tactical sense, is much more difficult. The Israelis would have to fly across Jordan, Iraq to get there, and then to get back. They'd have to carry the fuel and the ordnance to get there, and then the fuel to get back. Not so easy. Probably isn't going to happen. Another option, invade Iran. Where are the troops? Americans are already bogged down in Iraq and in Afghanistan. The Americans simply don't have any more troops to spare. The only way they're going to get them is to draft you all. Probably not a popular option. The third option, talk to Iran. Open negotiations. Just how do Iranian objectives and American objectives clash? Just what are the big issues? I suspect, personally, that as long as the Iranians are willing to guarantee the flow of oil to the United States, that the Americans can ease off on the continued rule of the Sunni dynasty in Bahrain. These issues are going to come up very soon. The Americans are in an untenable position, as they are on both sides of Iran. I think the sooner channels are open to Tehran, the better.
Thank you very much. Excellent presentation. Our last speaker is going to talk about Afghanistan, Dr. Brian Smith. He's Assistant Professor of Political Science, received a BA in Political Science from Oberlin College, and his MA and PhD degrees from Brown University. He has a lot of fields of specialization: comparative democracy, and democratization, international political economy, comparative political economy, and he teaches a lot of courses along the lines of those subjects, and is teaching, I believe, this semester in international relations. Yes, and was a research assistant at President Carter Center in Atlanta, and also has received many grants and fellowships from Brown University and Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholarship. So Dr. Smith's going to talk about the major developments, contemporary developments in Afghanistan. And once again, welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Isaacs, and good evening. I know we're running a little bit late, so I'll try to speak as quickly as I can. I've been asked to talk about contemporary developments in the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, and to do that, I want to first lay some groundwork. I want to make 4 specific points. I want to make a geographic point, I want to make a demographic point, and I want to make 2 historical points. If you'll take a look at the map that I handed out, it speaks to my first point, which is geographic. If you look at this map right here, my first point is that Afghanistan is not an easy country to get around in. It's an extremely mountainous country. It's been considered for hundreds of years to actually be one of the most beautiful countries in the world. Beautiful mountains. It used to be a favorite for hikers, actually, to go to Afghanistan from all around the world. And that wonderful beauty included its fantastic mountainous countryside that has made Afghanistan extremely hard to rule over the years. The country has almost never, in its entire history, been centrally controlled. There was actually only one point in history where you could even say that it was in any way centrally controlled by a specific government. Local clans, village elders have always had their own independent power and even their own independent laws scattered all over this mountainous countryside. The second part of how hard it is to get around in the country is on the flip side of that chart, with the fact that there are very few roads in Afghanistan. It is a very large country. It's actually about 20% larger than France. And by way of comparison, Afghanistan has roughly 8,000 kilometers of paved roads. By comparison, France has approximately 950,000 kilometers of paved roads. So it is a very hard country to simply move around in. Oh, and adding to the complication of moving around is the fact that for about 35 years, people have been littering the countryside with landmines and unexploded bomblets. The second point I want to make is demographic. Afghanistan is an extraordinarily ethnically diverse country, and ethnicity has always played a very serious role in economics, in history, and politics. 42% of the country is what is known as Pashtun. The Pashtun make up essentially a ethno-linguistic, technically they're a minority in the country, but they are the largest minority. 42% of the country means about 14 million people are Pashtuns. They are the largest single ethnic group. The second largest is Tajik. They make up about 27% of the country. From 1747, when the country really came together as an independent kingdom for the very first time ever, from 1747 to about 1978, every single ruler of Afghanistan has been Pashtun. It's the dominant political ethnicity in Afghanistan. In addition, if you'll notice on this map, right across the border from Afghanistan is Pakistan, and there's a very large minority in Pakistan that is Pashtun. They actually outnumber the Pashtun in Afghanistan by a significant amount. Western Pakistan and northwestern Pakistan, all along that mountainous border that you can see on the flip side, is Pashtun. In fact, they have 28 million Pashtuns in Pakistan. In fact, in the 1950s and 1960s, there was a brief movement inside of Pakistan and inside of Afghanistan to unite the Pashtun people into one independent Pashtun state. Obviously, this didn't go over so well in Pakistan, and they worked hard to prevent that, but the Pashtun tribal areas of western Pakistan have always had some autonomy, independence from the central Pakistan government. That's very important to the current situation in Afghanistan. Okay, so that's my second point, the demographic point, and I have two historical pieces of groundwork to lay. The first historical point I need to make is that in the modern history of Afghanistan, empire after empire after empire has tried to invade and conquer Afghanistan, and they have either failed or they have only been able to gain control of the major cities in Afghanistan. The British Empire, at the height of its power, the 19th century and early 20th century, the powerful British Empire which had finished conquering India by the beginning of the 20th century completely. They tried to invade the first time, they lost. They invaded again, decades later. That was sort of a draw. They managed to occupy the major cities, they managed to occupy Kandahar, they managed to occupy Kabul, and really only exercised power over that cities and put a government that was willing to play along into power. And then finally, they fought a third war, and the British lost that one too. Later in the 20th century, as has been, I think, briefly alluded to, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan after a series of coups in December of 1979. And the U.S. State Department estimates that the USSR, one of the two superpowers, after having rolled into Afghanistan with a large number of troops and sort of the equivalent of their Vietnam, they never ruled more than about 20% of the country at any one time. So that's the first historical point. The second historical point I want to make is that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda both got their start in the Pashtun areas of Pakistan. That northwestern tribal Pashtun areas of Pakistan. Al-Qaeda was created by a Saudi Arabian, who I hopefully don't have to mention, you all know who I'm talking about, Osama bin Laden. He created an organization to aid and assist Afghanis during the Soviet era of invasion in Afghanistan. He was funneling money and he was funneling arms into Afghanistan. And he did that by coordinating with the Pashtuns in Pakistan. There were an enormous number of refugees in Pakistan from Afghanistan. They had at that point, since 1973, approximately 7 years of civil war inside of Afghanistan. People had fled into these refugee camps across the border. And as is always the case, refugee camps tend to breed extremism. And Al-Qaeda hooked up with the Pashtun inside of Pakistan. They hooked up, in fact, with the Pakistani government. Osama bin Laden developed very close ties with the Pakistani intelligence services and the Pakistani military. And through this coordination of effort, they were able to flow arms and money into Afghanistan. And that's where Al-Qaeda got its start. Al-Qaeda eventually, after the Soviets left, Al-Qaeda ended up rabble-rousing a little bit in Saudi Arabia. They ended up getting kicked out of Saudi Arabia and ended up in Sudan. In the early 90s, they started receiving a lot of pressure from the United States and Saudi Arabia after Al-Qaeda started attacking us. We managed to force the government of Sudan to kick them out. And so naturally, where did they go? They went back to Afghanistan, where they had originally started, and started setting up camps. By the way, we actually flung cruise missiles into Afghanistan in 1998, trying to kill bin Laden, but we missed. Well, in any case, after the U.S. invasion in 2001, Al-Qaeda ended up fleeing to the Pashtun area of Pakistan. They just simply pulled back across that mountainous border where they were perfectly welcome, where they already knew people, they had ties in the area, and went to ground, and assumably they probably went presumably elsewhere. The Taliban also got its start in Pashtun, Pakistan. In those, again, camps of Afghani refugees who had fled the brutal civil wars that had been going on even after the Soviet Union had been kicked out. Taliban, by the way, in case you didn't know it, means students. A lot of the original sort of rank and file of the Taliban were Madras students who had been going to these religious schools out of these Afghani Pakistan refugee camps. Well, after the Taliban formed, with the support of the rural countryside of Afghanistan, which had never really supported these extreme radical Islamic positions of the Taliban, they were tired of the civil wars, the endless battles between the various warlords that had been tearing apart the country at that point for about 25 years. And so with the support of the countryside and with this support of the Pashtun in Pakistan, the Taliban pushed into Afghanistan, started taking on the fighting warlords, the warlords who had been feuding amongst themselves, and eventually took control of at most about 90% of the country. They managed to take control of really everything but the Tajik ethnic minority in the north. So you again have this Pashtun government that is putting in place a very brutal form of Islamic theocratic radicalism, certainly even to fundamental religious, very traditional conservative religious Afghanis were put off by the radicalism that had come across the border from these Pashtun Pakistani madrasas and camps. Eventually, an alliance of warlords was formed to fight against them. That alliance was actually called the United National and Islamic Front for the Salvation of Afghanistan. We know it in this country as the Northern Alliance. And after 9/11, and we pushed in, when we invaded the country, really all we did was we put a few troops on the ground, we supplied an air power and specialized spotters to work with the Northern Alliance, those groups of warlords who had been pushed off into the country, northern part of the country, to retake the country and to push the Taliban out of power. So that was my second historical point. So I want to very briefly look at the military, some recent military developments, some political developments, and economic developments, and hopefully those points will put these things into context for you. First, I want to talk about the military, because we are fighting a war there. In 2001, the United States used air power, and we followed it up with a slow increase of ground forces, but a lot of the ground forces came from NATO at first. The United States and NATO have been fighting the Taliban, the remnants of the Taliban, which fled to the countryside and fled across the border back into Pashtun, Pakistan. And a guerrilla war has been ongoing from 2001 right up until the present. We've also been fighting against NATO, and the United States has been also fighting against various militias. There's one or two other powerful armed groups throughout in Afghanistan, separate from the Taliban and Al-Qaeda as well. NATO has about 53,700 troops. Roughly half of that is American troops at this point. There are 23,500 American NATO forces in the country, which has sometimes been under American control, sometimes not. And we also have an additional 9,000 troops in the country. That's not part of the official NATO mission there. At first, the troops were limited mostly to Kabul. We once again also hoarded up inside the cities. We stayed tightly to these large cities militarily at first. But as the Taliban has slowly sort of found its footing and started launching more and more aggressive attacks across the Pakistani border into Afghanistan, we have been forced to go out of the major cities to deal with these incursions, with this fighting on a regular basis at this point. Since 2006, this has been particularly true. There's been an increasing amount of combat in eastern Afghanistan between our troops and the various Taliban forces, including moving into Pakistan. NATO, in fact, has been returning the favor of these cross-border attacks. They're attacking across, it's sort of actually reminiscent of the Vietnam War in some ways, of when there was striking across borders from another country we weren't supposed to be technically going into. Because the Taliban has been striking across that hugely mountainous, rugged, rural border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, and we have started striking back. We've been launching some airstrikes in, we've sent some troops in, we've been sending helicopters in, and there's been fighting actually in Afghanistan. And this has actually relatively recently expanded to clashes with the Pakistani military. There have been cases of Pakistani troops actually firing upon United States forces. Often one would have to assume these are Pakistani military forces in the Pashtun area, and possibly even Pashtun troops who may or may not be acting independently to fight against the American incursion. Really, we don't know. Also recently, the commander of British troops in Afghanistan, a brigadier general, not of all American NATO forces, but of just British troops, said that something that everybody has essentially known for a very long time, which is that we will never wipe out the Taliban. That this insurgency isn't going to be wiped out, that we're not going to simply be able to kill every member of the Taliban in the country. And he has said that as soon as NATO finishes beefing up the Afghani army with supplies and training and having increased numbers to be able to themselves defend against the Taliban's incursions, that would be the time to pull out. He essentially said this is not a winnable war in the sense that we can ever kill all Taliban fighters in the world, but rather the goal would be to make Afghanistan one more country in the world that has an active insurgency of armed rebels fighting against a government that's at least reasonably stable. And so that should be the goal, is what the British commander said, and pretty much everybody already knew, but now he's saying it publicly. Politically, the recent political developments, at least since 2001, Afghanistan is an Islamic republic, which basically means that they have democratic elections that are presumably, at least reasonably, free and fair. And there is a great deal of respect for Islamic law, however, in the country. The president is a man named Hamid Karzai. He actually controls little of the country himself. He's technically the president of Afghanistan, but he has been mocked for years by the Afghanis themselves as simply being, they call him the mayor of Kabul, because he has so very little control outside of the capital. He won an election to president in 2004 that had reportedly massive amounts of fraud. He had done a number of deals with some of the regional governors, the provincial governors, to become president, and in doing those deals, they sort of delivered the votes. And so he managed to win with about 55% support. Karzai is not a particularly religious man. He's not particularly Islamic. He's a Pashtun, which helps, but he has relatively little general support throughout the entire country. He was basically the guy that none of the warlords felt threatened by because he didn't have a power base of his own of any kind, and he wasn't particularly hated by anyone. And so he seemed to be the person that was agreeable to everyone, and the United States wanted him. The reason why the United States wanted him is a little bit longer story. He had been a deputy foreign minister under the government that controlled little bits of the country anyway, that the Taliban overthrew. And after the Taliban took control, he was sympathetic to the Taliban. He actually was pretty supportive of the Taliban government, of the Taliban regime after they took over. He was favored by the United States because after the Taliban took over, he went and became a consultant for a major oil company, Unocal, a United States oil company. And the Taliban negotiated while they were in power. They started negotiations to run an oil pipeline through Afghanistan. And so Karzai was part of those negotiations. He was influential in bringing Unocal and the Taliban government together. And so he was well known in American political and economic circles. After the 9/11 attacks, Karzai turned on the Taliban government and started consulting with the United States government about how to overthrow the Taliban. And so very rapidly after the Taliban did in fact flee the Northern Alliance, coming back out under the cover of American air support, the U.S. brokered a deal to put him in charge of the interim government from which he became president. The key political characteristic of Afghanistan is essentially, I would characterize it as an extremely high degree of fragmentation. Extreme fragmentation. Most candidates, for example, in the legislature ran as independents, but there are still, even with that, 83 official political parties in the country. The country is divided into provinces. It's controlled by 34 provincial governments, provincial governments run by provincial governors. Technically, they're picked by Karzai, but really they're the people Karzai had to appoint in order for him to become president. Most of them, well, not most of them, many of them, let us say, are actually former warlords. The various warlords of the Northern Alliance went back to ruling their particular regional homelands after the Northern Alliance pushed the Taliban out of power. On top of this, there are scores of tribes dividing up the country, hundreds of clans, sort of like sub-tribal units, and thousands of village elders. Particularly the Pashtun, but many other Afghanis have a very ancient history of having political power located very locally in what are called yurga, village councils of elders who are assumed to be essentially little private legislators everywhere around the entire country. This is that original geographic point that I made. On top of that, layered on top of all this massive political fragmentation, is a fragmentation of religious leaders. There are a variety of religious networks of power that are in conflict with each other as well, layered on top of the political battles going on. It's a very mountainous, in the middle of the mountainous countryside. Power is located in the hands of these clan and village leaders. Finally, in terms of politics, the Taliban has been playing some interesting politics also lately. Hezbollah was mentioned, I believe, by Dr. Hall, in Lebanon, had a very successful practice of achieving support around the rural countryside by essentially taking on the functions of government, taking on social policy, taking on building up infrastructure. Who do you turn to when you need medical supplies? Well, you turn to the Hezbollah. Who do you need to talk to about getting that water line fixed? Well, you talk to Hezbollah. Who gives you electricity? Hezbollah does. And they rode that eventually to political dominance in Lebanon at the moment. And the Taliban seems to be taking a page out of that same playbook, where the Taliban has actually started in those rural, rugged, mountainous countrysides of Pashtun villages, taking on that same sort of social, governmental roles that Hezbollah successfully used in Lebanon. So it appears like they're trying to rebuild their support in the rural countryside. Finally, tonight, I want to mention just a few economic points about Afghanistan. According to the CIA, which had the most recent number I could find on unemployment statistics in Afghanistan, I suppose since the fighting really raged up, nobody's been going door to door trying to find out if people are employed or not. But in 2005, there was about 40% unemployment in Afghanistan. So unemployment is a massive problem there. Standards of living remain very low. It's running at about $1,000 purchasing power parity per capita. So it's a poor, very low living standards. However, that being said, foreign investment has actually been pretty good since 2001. It's been steady. It's declined a little bit lately, but it's managed to stabilize, and with all this investment, the infrastructure is actually picking up a bit. That 8,000 kilometers of paved roads is actually up from 3,000 kilometers of paved roads back in 2001. Also, the money supply is stable. I guess that's better than ours at the moment. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, has reported that opium production is also up 4,000% since 2001, which is great economic news for Afghanistan because many of the farmers in Afghanistan have to turn to opium production, and have been for a very long time, as the only thing that really pulls in enough money to allow them to live off of. In fact, last year was a record crop for the numerous opium farmers of Afghanistan. Afghanistan is the largest producer of opium in the world. They produce 90% of the world's opium. The crop last year was so huge that it has the potential to be turned into 947 metric tons of heroin. So that's doing pretty well. General McKiernan, who is the current head of NATO forces, suggested just last week that the military should start being used against drug lords in Afghanistan. The mandate of NATO troops, he has claimed, covers the attacking of drug lords, because drug lords are also purchasing guns and also dealing in guns, which are supplying them to local private armies of the various provincial governors, as well as militias, plus the Taliban. And so in self-defense, NATO has suggested they should start acting against the Afghani drug lords, some of whom are actually provincial governors. But it is not clear whether or not they're ever going to be doing anything about the opium production itself, because they're in a strange political position. Even if they can extend the NATO mandate to, say, attacking crops, wiping out these opium crops, they're in a very strange political bind, in that they're trying desperately to improve their relations with the countryside, farmers and villagers and localities. And if they start destroying their only livelihood, the opium that they produce, then we could lose politically the very battle we're trying to fight. And of course, you have to roll this into the fact that we're fighting against heroin traffic and heroin producers all around the world, heroin sellers, and here we have a large military with its air force sitting on top of the world's heroin farm and not doing anything about it, because they can't politically, because of the wars and the instabilities in Afghanistan. And thank you for your time.
Great presentation. We got some time for a few questions. I mean, you must have some questions. There's been so much information. Yes, David?
This may be kind of a naive question, but I'm assuming that of the three countries, Iran probably has the most stable market system, banking system.
Yes.
I'm wondering if the three of you could speculate about what the current oil crisis will do to those countries, which are not playing on the same level that European and American banks are playing.
You take
What will
Iraq.
happen?
You take Iraq. For Iran, this is a real threat because of the dependence on the oil. And oil is obviously demand for oil is going down. So the other kinds of things Iran produces now they can sell in international markets are agricultural. They are the big source of pistachio. So it's going to be a problem for sure.
Don't forget saffron.
Saffron, yes.
What about their banking interests, though? How will it affect just the ordinary person's ability to get access to money?
Well, just like everywhere else, they're tied into the world system. They're not isolated in terms of their financial institutions.
The main impact on Afghanistan would be simply a drop in foreign investment, both actual private investment being moved into Afghanistan, but also I would gather the willingness of the various countries who have been providing a great deal of infrastructure improvement and direct investment themselves will dry up. But in terms of the average person in Afghanistan would probably be largely unaffected. Things basically can't get any more primitive or bad.
As far as Iraq goes, same thing except in the Kurdish north. The Kurdish north is pretty prosperous and pretty autonomous. As a matter of fact, they have set up a new university there, the American University, and it's in Suleimania. I mean, Kurdistan's doing pretty well, but they're getting probably bombed by Turkey as we speak. So.
Is there another question? Okay, well, let me thank the three speakers. They were all great, excellent presentations. And I want to thank you again for your participation, and we hope you have an enjoyable evening, rest of the evening. Thank you.